Suffering, even though you're not the cause of that suffering.
Yes.
Is there anything wrong with that kind of bet?
Thriving because other people are suffering
Right.
is a bet that leaves blood on your hands.
So would you say that that was the case in the bet against the housing market?
The people who are taking the other side of the bet are like the messenger saying things are out of line. But are they the murderer?
Should companies be able to take out life insurance policies on their employees? Traditionally, companies have done this for, let's say, CEOs. But what about on their rank and file employees, maintenance workers, janitors? In fact, sometimes company-owned life insurance policies are called janitors insurance. Walmart, it turns out, took out life insurance policies on its maintenance workers, on its janitors, on its clerks, even without their knowing, so that when one of them died, the company would get the insurance payout, $300,000, let's say. How many are against? How many think there should be a law preventing companies from taking out policies on their rank and file workers? All right, why should this be prohibited?
If it's for an incredibly skilled employee like a CEO, that's one thing. However, if it's a rank and file, less skilled or unskilled employee, it's disrespectful.
Disrespectful to turn the death of an employee into an occasion for profit. That's what bothers you?
Yes.
I have no problem with having an insurance on the worker's life as long as the worker has explicitly agreed. But if it happens without worker's consent, I think it's problematic because it basically violates his right to, almost like he no longer disposes with the profit that is made from his body, like the fruits of his labor, if you want to call it even.
The fruits of his labor,
Or
he's dying.
Like what he has produced so far belongs to him, so he has the right to give it to someone else.
I do acknowledge that it's a voluntary transaction between the insurance company and the corporation.
Right.
However, if the individual does not know that a life insurance policy is being taken out in his or her name, I have a problem with that, especially because the money that could go towards the family is going towards the corporation, and that's where I think the problem is.
You cannot take out life insurance on a person without the person's consent.
Why not?
Oh, that's very important.
Why is that?
That goes back hundreds of years. Because if you do that, you have an interest in the person's death, right?
That's right.
You take out a life insurance policy on another person, then you kill the person, and you get the proceeds.
But suppose the laws against murder are enforced.
The laws against nothing are 100% effective.
So Walmart should not be able to take out a life insurance
No,
policy.
it has
on
to
its-
get the permission of the person whose life is being insured. There's nothing wrong with that.
We're talking here about the maintenance worker, the janitor, who won't be costly to replace. Should Walmart be able to take out a life insurance policy on his life?
If the person consents, why would the person care? Right? You're not hurt.
I think you have to get deep into what consent is. My sense is that the consent of the worker is almost like a bribe, but that doesn't erase what's happening from your mind. So I would say I consented because what was the alternative? So it seems to me there's a disembodied nature in the way you described it, which is they're just taking care of their actuarial cost benefit. But the question is, does it also alter the psychology of the human interaction?
I would be uncomfortable if an employer did that, but as long as you've got safeguards in place to make sure that their duty of care to their workers are upheld, it's difficult to make the case for making it illegal.
If you were such a worker and you suddenly discovered, as Walmart workers did when the Wall Street Journal exposed this practice, how would you feel?
I would ask a lot of questions of my employer as to why they were doing this and what risks they were mitigating, and I would want to have a conversation about it.
My exception to the insurance policy is that it sort of betrays the purpose of the insurance policy, which was to provide security in times of turnover or in providing security to the family. But here, it's almost like a form of alternative finance.
It's a kind of death bet or a financial instrument.
Right.
But why, if there's no coercion involved, and if no one's rights are being violated?
You sort of have a right to dignity. What comes along with that is the right to know when it's being compromised, and I think it's being compromised when you take out these life insurance policies.
And why is my dignity being compromised if, unbeknownst to me, someone else has taken out a life insurance policy on me and profits when I die. Why does that offend my dignity?
It's sort of an objectification. You have this relationship with your employer, and there's sort of a mutual understanding that you see each other as partners almost. And here you have your partner benefiting up to something like $500,000 for the benefit of your death. That's what I find repugnant.
Even if the company doesn't hasten my death by closing the fire escapes in the
Right.
in the
Well, there's no
company or
immediate
factory.
harm in any case of objectification. It doesn't change the fact that we can find it repugnant.
Lindsay and Alex, you think that it's wrong for the company to take out life insurance policy on its janitors without their consent. Yes? If they had given consent, it would be okay?
I believe so. I think that because the janitor is so directly involved here, then I feel like it should be worded in their employment contract.
I don't think so. You will have to sign this contract even if you do not like the fact that after you die, the company will take your money instead of your family. But he has no other option. Somebody who works at Walmart, they have to work there at very, very little wages. So I doubt how much of an accurate consent does that worker have in this case.
But this argument that automatically makes Walmart obliged to sign a life insurance that gives money to them.
Walmart should not treat that person as an asset or as an object and take money of their death. They should pay for their services, but should not buy their life and bet on it.
I disagree with that completely. I think that's based on an assumption that's not true. You believe that Walmart is the only employment option for these people, which in labor markets is not the case.
Hang on, the debate about consent is a familiar debate. It's similar to ones we've had before about whether people who are poor can truly give their consent under certain circumstances. So that's one issue. But I want to get back to this question about whether the company should have to get the consent of the worker in order to take out a life insurance policy. Suppose I'm the worker, and some third party decides to take out a life insurance on me, in effect, to enter into a bet with someone else about when I will die. I've not consented, maybe I don't even know about it. Why does that side bet on my life in any way violate my rights or do me harm, Alex?
Well, because they're profiting from you and they do not have your consent, I don't see how it is okay for someone to be betting on my life without having my agreement on it.
I agree. I think that the idea of consent is crucial here.
Why? What harm is done to you? If Kevin and Jamie know that you have 2 job offers, Lindsay, they're speculating on which one you will choose, and one of them wins that bet, wins $100. Have they violated your rights?
I'm not sure if it's about rights, but I would be uncomfortable if other people are profiting from my experiences without me having a say in it.
And why is that?
I just think that I would have to be informed on that.
So if they told you, Lindsay, we've got a bet going about which job offer you'll take, and that's fine?
And I said, okay, I think that's fine. Again, I think consent is crucial.
And why?
Individuals have a right, perhaps, to say what other people can have a stake in you.
Don't you think you'll be treated like a casino when somebody bets on you?
If I am consenting to it, then no, of course not.
Either way, whether you consented or not, people are still playing on you, they're gaming on you.
I don't have a problem with the commodification if consent is given.
Most states have now enacted laws requiring consent of the worker before the company can take out life insurance policy. Suppose those laws are in place. Let's assume the consent is not coerced, and let's assume that Walmart can't create hazards in the workplace or fail to enact health and safety measures. Some of you still think it's objectionable.
Yeah, of course.
Kevin, why?
It's offensive to shared community values. But I would argue that we do all agree upon a certain conception of certain rights which we are all entitled to.
Kevin, what right is being violated?
It's a certain type of human dignity which involves some conception of liberty and life mixed together, I believe.
But they're not killing you and they're not depriving you of your liberty.
But I don't feel, as a fully respected and dignified human being.
So it's a matter of dignity.
It is a matter of dignity.
By making you as a worker more valuable dead than alive, they affront your dignity.
And that dignity is based in my rights to life and liberty.
Nicole.
We treat life and death with an enormous amount of respect. We have lots of cultural practices that are associated with the transition from life to death. And one of those is like utmost respect for the family. It's a type of community bonding, and this seems to undermine that by somebody profiting when you die. And
So
it's not
what
like
about
All right,
a
Jamie.
government who provides pensions, where if you die at 70, we only have to provide pensions for X years. If you die at 90, we have to provide pension for X plus 20 years. They're directly profiting from you dying sooner.
Jamie raises a hard counterexample. Governments that run pension funds have an interest in people dying sooner rather than later. And not only governments, but also private pension funds and annuities that are committed to a certain payout over a lifetime. Is that morally questionable?
because the pension so directly benefits the worker, I'm, I think, more willing to let that slide. But I really see why you brought that up.
Some people are morally uneasy with the idea of markets that give investors a rooting interest in the early death or the misfortune of others. I'd like to come back to this question about whether promoting or encouraging certain virtues and discouraging certain bad attitudes is a legitimate reason for constraining markets through law. And let's take an example to test this. Take the case of death pools, this internet game that involves gambling on the lives of celebrities. You try to predict who will die in the coming year, and you typically give a list, I don't know, of 10 well-known people, and whoever gets the most correct guesses wins the pot. Now, there is no socially redeeming purpose that's served. It's just a kind of death bet for fun and some profit. How many find it ethically objectionable, death pools? Almost everyone. How many would ban it? So almost everyone finds it morally objectionable. Only a handful would ban it. Why is that? Let's hear first from someone who finds it morally troubling but would not ban it.
The reason why I wouldn't ban it, but I still find it morally objectionable, comes back to one can make moral judgments, but not necessarily legislate them.
Emily.
I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One of these goes back to the idea of like the lack of consent.
None of the
I think-
celebrities
Right.
give their consent to
Right.
being voted upon. For it to be morally acceptable, the people would have to phone up the Pope and say, do you mind if I vote, if I put you on my list? What would that
It
even
seems
mean?
absurd to do that.
Yeah.
For me, I think even if they were to give their consent, I still find it morally objectionable. And between people who find this site interesting and enjoyable and people who would go out in the world and act upon that sensibility that leads them to this site,
Right.
I think that there creates a danger to the rest of society in that sense.
So clearly that would be morally objectionable. But let's say for the sake of argument that the laws against murder, particularly of celebrities, can be enforced. And let's just assume that the existence of these internet death pools does not lead to people going out and assassinating celebrities. I'm trying to get at whether there is some objection to the attitude, to the lack of virtue, that should make enough of a difference to constrain markets in this case.
I don't think that engaging with a death pool has enough of a negative externality to deem it important to write that into law.
You used the word negative externality. I was asking about attitudes and virtues. Do you think they're the same?
One kind of negative externality is some kind of tainted social norm. And in this case, the social norm that's created by death pools is not strong enough to warrant legislation. Traditionally,
Externalities are thought to be effects on third parties and typically tangible physical harms, taking the life or violating the liberty of a third party. Does giving expression to bad attitudes, does that also count as a negative externality?
I think so. I think that rape porn, for example, the perverse attitudes that are created by that have a negative externality in the sense that they create a negative attitude towards women and they endorse rape. And for me, that is an instance in which the law should become involved. But in this case, I find that there is not a problem with death pools because no one's being harmed. I think the correlation you would find between people becoming murderers and engaging in death pools is probably quite low.
All right, now I want to come to Lindsay on this question. Constraining markets because they express and promote bad attitudes.
I'm a strong proponent of liberal neutrality where I do not believe it's easy to say what a bad attitude is. I think that is different for every person and should not be subscribed into law. And in this particular case, my problem is with the issue of consent. If they were to telephone up somebody and ask for consent, then I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Why the need for consent?
Once again, I feel like the person is so directly involved in this.
Well, but suppose a journalist writes an unflattering review of some famous actor's performance in a play or in a movie. Do they have to get their consent?
But the difference with that is that the person is providing a service, and I don't see that is playing out here. If I knew that 70% of people thought I was going to die that year without my giving consent to them being a part of that, I would say that's the problem.
Now, these are all public figures. These are all celebrities. Lots of things are written and published about them all the time, many of them derogatory. Think of the politicians on the list.
And I'm totally fine with being derogatory in terms of their actions, their participation in films, or the speeches that they just gave.
Even without their consent?
That's fine, because that's their service that they have chosen to provide to society.
All right, so Kevin, what do you say on the death pools?
Oh, absolutely wrong. They should be illegal.
You agree,
They
Abdul?
should be illegal because, regardless if there is consent or not, because there is a negative attitude that is being promoted in society when people are practicing this act.
Bad attitude.
Bad attitude.
It's corrupting.
It's making the death of people something more than, like, it's becoming a game.
There are certain behaviors, certain inactions where you might be able to engage without necessarily always rooting for harm. I watch the Super Bowl, but I don't watch UFC and incredibly violent boxing. I can watch the football without rooting for harm of another player. I don't cheer when there's a big hit.
So you think boxing should be banned?
I think that there might be some people who can watch it without that harm.
There is no athletic competition that I have seen broadcast on a television or attended myself where I have not seen a majority of individuals who celebrate negative events happening to members of other teams.
But I don't think you root against the welfare of the players of
You don't necessarily have to
I
root
don't
for harm.
agree with it.
I think it is totally fair to say, I really want to beat Syracuse today. However, I think it is totally repulsive for me to say, I really want to see their star player break his face.
But the problem with that is I don't see a way to legislate against it, neither do I see a way to make it right to legislate
What we
for
might
it in
not be
cases
able
like
to
this.
necessarily legislate against is the thought that another player should be harmed in a sport, for example. Just as we might be able to not necessarily legislate against the thought of enjoying a particular celebrity dying, but we can legislate against the possibility of somebody making money off of that fact.
Would the idea of celebrity pools, that's essentially gambling, and in many states, is gambling not considered illegal?
Until relatively recently, most states banned gambling, with a few exceptions. Right. Increasingly, with the rise of casino gambling and other forms of gambling, these laws are being changed. So what we're debating right now is actually the ethics of speculation. Speculation detached from, in the case of the death pool, any socially useful purpose. Go ahead, Alex.
I see absolutely no problem in gambling, but when someone starts playing with your life behind your back without you knowing, I almost think it does harm.
Even if you don't know about it?
Well, because there is a chance that you're going to find out, and then the consequences are not going to be negligible. I know that if I found out my name on a website and someone betting like he's going to die today or tomorrow, I'm not going to be happy about this without me knowing.
So it's the idea of people speculating, having a stake in your misfortune without your consent, that you're troubled by.
Yes, and also by the negative consequences of finding out that this is going on.
All right, let me ask about a different, broader kind of speculation. Just before the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of people had taken on mortgages that they couldn't afford. And there were some investors who said, there's a great housing bubble, and found complex financial instruments to bet against the housing market, to bet, in effect, that a lot of people would not be able to pay their mortgages. That's exactly what happened. The housing market crashed, and one hedge fund manager made $3 to $4 billion in 1 year betting on the collapse of the housing market. He didn't contribute to the misfortune of the people who lost their homes, but he did have a tremendous financial windfall from the fact that they had lost their homes. He didn't have their consent when he bet they wouldn't be able to pay their mortgages. He made huge profits from it. Is there something wrong with that?
I don't think so.
Then what's the difference?
Well, the difference is that in the first case, it's about impacting an individual directly, whereas in the second case, it's more like
losing a home, not just money.
I don't say it's good, but I do think that losing your home is better than losing your life in the
Yes.
first place. Second, I think that when betting impacts an individual directly, it's a little bit different than when it impacts.
But the death pool doesn't affect the people being bet upon directly.
It does impact you directly in a way. Someone is betting on your life.
Chances are they don't even know about it. Most of the celebrities.
But I still think that when it's collective, it's different. I don't know.
Think about
Nicole.
the situation in which this speculation arose. You know, like this is somebody who's in the financial industry. They know that the housing market is going to collapse. And instead of doing something about it, what did they do? They said, no, I will speculate against the housing market. How is that not morally objectionable?
That's not necessarily true. They could have told people about it and still profited from it. And they may not be betting against the people who are losing their homes, but rather betting against the people who are creating the systematic
How do you feel
failure.
okay with yourself having profited off of that?
But I still wouldn't make it illegal in a way. I don't know.
I think that it's most certainly morally objectionable. The fact that somebody is standing to make a lot of money off of the collapse of the housing market might be a signal to all of us that the housing market's about to collapse.
Really, we should be looking at the regulators that look the other way and these complex financial policies that nobody understood in the first place. I think it's wrong to place all of the blame on this investor that profited from it.
There are books that have been written about how to profit from an impending crisis.
But why would you want to profit from an impending crisis?
Because of the recognition that people are systematically creating failure and that you're trying to change something. There's this one economist, everybody laughed at him when he continually went on business networks saying, look, right now we're headed for a crisis. You should listen to me. People laugh at him because the majority had this different perspective. They were being greedy. They wanted to continually profit from these bad mortgages. Whereas someone who was trying to help others.
Exactly, and so do you not think he would have been listened to better if there was a regulation in place that actually stopped everyone from speculating against people keeping their houses?
But we shouldn't fault him for profiting.
The outcome of this is so detrimental that in this case it is absolutely acceptable to prevent speculation. It's like speculation in food markets that can cause widespread hunger and poverty.
But don't you agree that you can usually only see that after the crisis has occurred?
Well, he clearly didn't.
Well, he saw it, but when there's a majority who is seeing, hey, this looks good, like the economy's booming, it's a bubble, but like people don't know that.
He probably went around saying, listen, crises are coming. But do you think making money off people's misery, do you think the act in itself is morally wrong?
What I'm fine with is him warning other people to try to improve their lives by looking past what seems to be a growing economy and benefit from something that they see is going to happen in the future that's negative.
Forget about the house market. Making money off people's misery. People are suffering and you're making money with them, regardless if it's speculation or anything else. Are you fine with that morally? This is my question.
You can't just say you're profiting off of people's misery. You could say you're profiting off of the mistakes of bureaucrats and...
No, but the outcome is misery.
I find it objectionable in a way, but I don't understand how his actions are harming people.
Would it make it better if he suffered too, if everyone just suffered?
They said publicly that this is what's going to happen.
Right.
And nobody listened to them.
Right.
When they put their money where their mouth was. So they made a lot of money, which is great, right? Because it's a lesson you can lose your shirt in a crash, but it's also a lesson that if you're very careful, you will see the crash coming. And then you'll be rewarded, even though you'll be despised as a naysayer.
But betting on the misfortune of others, is there anything wrong with that?
No. No, what you're betting on is the mistakes made by the investors who created the bubble. Nothing you do hurts the investors who lose their shirt.
Thriving because other people are suffering is a bet that leaves blood on your hands.
And so would you say that that was the case in the bet against the housing market?
The customers were abused
at
the expense of the people they relied on for their investment advice.
Which is a separate...
That's a fraud. The people who are taking the other side of the bet are like the messenger saying things are out of line. But are they the murderer?
Okay, well, they're not the murderer.
Right.
But you said still they had blood on their hands.
It feels like there's cause and effect. If people perceive that and you live in society as a person who made a lot of money in that circumstance, are you sure you don't have blood on your hands, that you just took an innocent bet?
I want to try to isolate the moral consideration, even where you were not the agent of the misfortune.
I've not seen the person speculating against the housing bubble as someone who is gleeful about people losing their homes. They are saying something is unsustainable in our economic structure.
And saying so by shorting the housing market might achieve some social good.
Well, there could be some preventive resistance to the formation of the bubble.
Sometimes I think it's very easy to say, well, what social value is provided by people making bets? The usual argument is that in the process of making bets, they are generating information for the market about likely outcomes and making the market more efficient and resulting in better pricing in the market as a result of that. I mean, it's interesting that those people who made bets around the housing market were betting against conventional wisdom. And in some ways you think, if only more people were doing that, the prices would have adjusted and we would have had a better chance of anticipating the collapse in the market.
There would have been less of a bubble?
There would have been less of a bubble. So that's why I hesitate by criticizing that behavior. I think the trickier question is who should have paid for the consequences of it, and who should have been bailed out.
The issue here is not whether the speculator was to blame for the housing crisis.
Yeah.
That's not the issue. No. The issue is the moral status of his gains.
Yeah.
Should these be considered morally tainted gains in the same way that the winner of a death pool, we consider those gains morally tainted? Are they on a par or are they different? That's the question, Josh, I think that they should be asking you.
There's definitely a disconnect between death and bad economic times that can be improved.
And losing your house, losing your kids' education, and so on.
Your objection is to the idea of profiteering from other people's misery, which is what occurred in the housing crisis. But what if that speculator used those profits to reinvest in the people who suffered? Would that suddenly become an okay...
I think that's extending the analogy to a place
but
where
we're talking about the
trying to
practice
trap
itself,
us.
though. The ethics of the bet itself.
For me, it's not about the act, it's about the impact that the act has. And the ability to speculate in a global financial market on the demise of many, many people who are homeowners means that in this instance there has to be some kind of regulation. I'm not particularly interested in whether any bank is to blame or even if they reimburse people. I'm more interested in the fact that this sends a signal to the wider financial market that it's okay to engage in activities that are in the long term detrimental.
It promotes a bad attitude and a bad social norm, you think?
Yeah.
And therefore it should be discouraged.
Using loaded phrases like making money off of other people's misery, I see that as a bad way to approach this argument, quite honestly. Obviously, financial markets are extremely complex things that are constantly changing. With that in mind, the financial market should be regulated, not because betting against the housing market was a morally corrupt decision. Regulation should come less from a perception of morally bad decisions in financial markets and more from the idea that there are business cycles that happen and the result of those business cycles can have negative impacts on the wider population.
I want to return to the idea of promoting bad attitudes as you were talking about. I just have constant issue with this, and I have a question for you, Jamie. What about if it was on a smaller scale? Would you be in favor of or would you be opposed to, for example, shorting a company's stock because it would promote a bad attitude?
I don't think that's really promoting a bad attitude. It's just as much as one company will falter, it's for general efficiency of the economy just as much.
I disagree with that because you're still hoping that somebody else and a whole group of a company of people will fail.
Naturally, in a competitive economy, failure occurs for general productivity's sake. So in the case of shorting a company, I don't think it's directly comparable.
You have to sacrifice something to increase the general welfare. So in this case, you're sacrificing the well-being of one company to increase the general economic well-being.
But he might not be sacrificing anybody's rights or, in his attitude, be devalidating somebody's rights. Yes, you might be rooting for financial ruin. However, I believe that the fully public benefit of a more competitive market enabled by shorting of financial markets and financial firms is a reasonable benefit. But I'm willing to engage with it for a strictly public benefit. A strictly private benefit, Walmart just making $300,000 because somebody they could easily replace just happens to get knocked off by a heart attack, that's not okay. Death pools because some person that you really want to die just happens to die, definitely not okay. But if you can note a sincere public benefit, then that's a different story altogether.
But so if there was a public benefit, you would be okay with shorting a housing market?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you could, you would have to pass a pretty high test, I think. I think you'd have to answer Ellie's criticism that you are not encouraging coarse, short-sighted attitudes in the larger commodities and securities markets.
And who's to determine those coarse, short-sighted
We've got
attitudes?
regulators, we've got economists.
Let me see if we can step back from these debates we've been having about the ethics of speculation and draw some provisional conclusions. We've had a series of discussions now about the ethics of markets, debates about where markets serve the public good and where they don't belong. I think one of the great missing debates in our politics in recent decades is the question, what should be the role of money and markets in a good society? And we've not agreed case by case on the answer to that question. We've heard arguments about efficiency. We've debated the meaning of liberty, of fairness, of consent. And we've also debated the question, to what extent should we limit markets for reasons beyond consent and fairness, reasons having to do with promoting certain attitudes or social norms that make for a good society? Or should government and law try to step back from our disagreements and debates about what are the best attitudes to cultivate and simply let markets govern, provided they don't violate people's rights? I think it's no accident that in recent decades, as market reasoning and market values have become more prominent in our public life, the quality and character of our public discourse has been hollowed out. I think that what we need in democracy today is a morally more robust kind of public discourse from the one we've become accustomed to. And I think that anyone who's been listening to the discussions that this group has been engaged in can see, I think, a glimpse of what a morally engaged, morally robust kind of public discourse might be. And for that, I want to thank you all very much.